When we go outside, we actually inhale molecules that go through our nose and can tell our brain about what's happening. That when we spend time outside, it changes the microbiome, changes our immune system.
Welcome to the Good Clean Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Ginger Hultin, a registered dietitian nutritionist. Today on the show, we're learning all about brain health with Dr. Austin Perlmutter. Dr. Perlmutter is an internal medicine doctor who focuses on helping people improve their health through better decisions, neuroscience, and lifestyle interventions. In the last episode, we focused on the brain-gut connection, the role of immunity in brain health, and we busted some common myths about the brain-diet connection. If you missed that one, you'll want to go back and take a listen. Today, we're talking to Dr. Perlmutter about nature and the brain with some practical tips for your life based on science. One of the most important parts of my day, every day, is spending time in nature first thing in the morning. I go on a 45-minute walk in my neighborhood, and that's no matter the weather. It is so much easier when it's light out, when the birds are chirping, and when it's not pouring rain. But I'm really committed to this because it makes a huge difference in my life and a huge difference in my day when I get out there. So I've got rain boots and walking shoes and an umbrella sometimes and all sorts of raincoats. I see this as a huge barrier to my clients. So one thing I often hear is, I'm going to walk more when it's not so hot out, or I'm going to walk more when it's not so rainy out, or I'm going to walk more next season. And it's so easy to just push that off into the future. So I do set so many goals with my clients to get that right gear, right? Maybe you need a windbreaker or a warmer coat or a lighter coat. Maybe you need different shoes. Some of my clients even have walking poles. Those can really make a difference for your walks. Maybe you need to drive somewhere to walk. I also recommend that people consider getting a dog because there's some really interesting research that shows that people that have a dog to walk actually get out more than people that don't. It's just is so important to get creative to overcome those barriers. So look at what's in your way and find a way to bust through it so that you get that nature in your life every day. Walking is a great place to start. Welcome in, Dr. Perlmutter. Let's talk about what nature does to your body and brain. I'd love to hear from you about setting the stage for why we all should really be spending more time outside in nature.
If we think about modern day humans and then we compare them to our ancestors, there are a number of things that we do differently now compared to where we were maybe before 10,000 years ago, but certainly even compared to where we were 100 or 200 years ago. And one of the biggest changes is simply that we've become an indoor species, right? We spent the majority of our evolution outside, and certainly we built shelters, but the majority of our day was spent out of doors. And I am 100% thrilled with some of the benefits that come from being inside and not being eaten by mosquitoes and having climate control and having light that we can use after dark. But these things come with a price. And we're now recognizing to what extent that price is kind of compromising overall health and especially brain health. So this is the idea of something like nature deficit, that we have experienced this issue that has derived from not just the fact that we are in front of our screens, but that we're not getting exposure to some of the healing properties of nature. Now, some of the statistics that I will cite are a little bit disturbing, but could at least trigger some alarm bells. So modern day Americans spend 93% of their day in their cars or inside buildings. We are spending the vast majority of our time indoors. What are we actually doing with our time? Typical American adult is spending 4 hours a day watching TV, a little over 2 hours a day on their phones, a lot of which is on social media, and around 11 plus hours of their day, which is most of their waking hours, engaging with media of some form or another. So if we're not spending time outside, if we're spending all of our time indoors, what have we lost? If we think about what this is doing to our health, we can look at this from two different perspectives. One is, what is the damage that is being caused by our incessant exposure to technology, the indoors, to fluorescent lighting that keeps us up at night, to the constantly stressful environment that we're getting as far as the content we're consuming through our eyes and through our ears. And the other part of this is, what are we missing out on in not being in nature? So we know, for example, that people who live in urban areas may be at higher risk of developing certain brain health conditions like Alzheimer's. And that may be a reflection of air pollution that is found in these urban centers. One kind of representation of what it means to be in an urban center. That's not generalized. So certain urban centers may actually have low levels of air pollution, but it is a component of it. We know that for certain people, especially adolescents and young girls, too much exposure to social media is associated with negative mental health effects. And obviously, if you're outside walking around in the forest, you're not consuming social media. But the point being that too much exposure to these things as a standalone may be an issue. In addition, adults watching TV, paying too much attention to the news, this is actually one of the top ranked reasons why people are experiencing stress. Stress, long-term and short-term, is damaging to the brain. On the flip side, what about what we get when we go into nature? So a host of studies have shown that when we're spending time in nature, we have better mental health, we have better cognitive health, we feel more empathy, we feel more connected to other people, to the planet. And is it just the fact that we're not being exposed to the typical modern day stimuli? I think it's more to it than that, because we now know that when we go outside, we actually inhale molecules that go through our nose and can tell our brain about what's happening. That when we spend time outside, it changes the microbiome, changes our immune system. And this is research that's been shown in elementary school children, where they basically had them do their classrooms outside. They changed their classrooms. So they were in the dirt. They were spending the time outside, and they actually measured their microbiome on their skin and then their immune system and found beneficial changes when people spent that time outside. So there is something to be said for vitamin N, for nature exposure. Nature exposure is medicine for the brain. And many doctors are now prescribing nature. They're giving prescriptions for nature because of these benefits. We all know this intrinsically, right? That there's something magical, amazing when we go camping, when we go on a hike, when we spend time in nature. But now we're able to quantify it. Now we're able to say more objectively, here are some of those benefits that can be realized.
I really want to hear about the specifics of what it does, especially for the brain. And I definitely want to hear how much.
One of the most important things that nature does for our bodies and for our brains is that it is a potent way of decreasing psychological stress. And so there's two ways to come at this. One is when we're in nature, we're not doing the things that are stressful. We know that our modern day lives are stressful, that checking our emails incessantly on our phones right before we go to sleep, first thing when we wake up, and getting pinged from Slack and reading the news and scrolling on social media, it's just constantly lighting up the emotional centers in our brain, making us feel fear. And by the way, as much as we like to think differently, our brains can't really differentiate between something that is actually dangerous to us and something that we're seeing on a screen that has no bearing. So you could see a spooky movie of some sort of a ghost or a demon. That's very unlikely to be a real threat for you, but we still feel scared. That's why we like the scary movie. What we don't think about often is when we look at these stories about all these horrible things happening in the world, your brain still interprets that as a stress. And so you feel stress. So when we are spending time in a stressful environment, which is the modern world, that is bad for our brain health. And being away from that is good for our brain health. Nature takes us away from it. There's one study I like. It was done in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They took people and just had them go into an urban, natural environment for 20 minutes a week. So we're talking about basically going into a city park, for example. They showed that they had lower levels of the stress hormone cortisol as measured in their saliva. One time, 20 minutes a week, successful at decreasing the stress marker. So just getting out of the stressful environment into nature is a great way to help tone down those stress pathways. Beyond that, what we see is when people spend time in nature, it calms a number of additional pathways related to stress. We see decreased sympathetic tone. Sympathetic tone would mean lower blood pressure, would mean lower heart rate, would mean more heart rate variability when we spend time in nature. All of which are great because chronic stress is toxic to the brain. Chronic stress leads to higher rate of mental health issues, cognitive health issues. So this is a great reason why nature exposure is actually a potent intervention for mental health and for cognitive health. One of the additional areas of this research that is fascinating, and I think something everyone needs to know about, is that being in nature seems to help restore our attention. And this is something called attention restoration theory. And the idea here being that when we allow our eyes, allow our consciousness to be focused on these natural scenes, that it helps us to restore our attention, our focus, so we can come back to whatever we were doing before and be more engaged. And researchers have shown this not only in real nature, but they've started to show this just when people are looking at these virtual reality scenes of nature. They've actually done this study where they took people and they had them look either at virtual photos of nature or virtual simulated cityscapes. And then they tested them on how they made decisions. And they found that when people looked at the buildings, they made more impulsive choices, meaning they would choose a smaller reward now versus a larger reward later. Whereas people who were looking at the natural environments were more willing to delay gratification. And beyond this, we see that when people spend time in nature, it creates feelings of awe. Feelings of awe help to create empathy for other people, for the planet. There's this idea of the small sense of self. It's kind of, you lose a little bit of the ego when you're looking up at, let's say, a sequoia or some other tree or a mountain or a big river. You realize, you know what? My problems are not so consequential in this bigger picture of this planet and this universe in which I'm not such a big person. And I think there's something super important there that we've kind of progressively lost as a species. We're so focused on the achievement as individuals, as opposed to as a tribe, as opposed to as a community, as opposed to as a planet. And when you get out there and start to see the scale of things, and you're not just tunnel visioned in on your computer screen or on your phone, I think there's some real benefits there.
Well, it sounds like it would be the perfect thing to do to break up your day also, especially if you get so much benefit to all your systems and we're just so plugged in. So taking those breaks sounds like a really actionable thing that people could do.
I think that's absolutely true. And some great ways to get a little bit more nature into your day are to take a coffee walk outside, or perhaps to do a meeting outside, or eat a meal outside, or just go to a park and meditate. There's so many ways to do a little bit more nature in your life that can be so gratifying.
You mentioned something that I talk a lot to my clients about, stress. I'd like to hear more about that as it relates to brain health, but also nature. When I am onboarding somebody, I have them rate their stress and say what it's coming from. And then we weave it into all of our conversations. So constantly trying to decrease stress or manage it better, release it in some ways is a huge piece of my work. So can you talk about what stress does to the brain and how we can start to work around that, maybe with nature?
I'd start by saying we all need stress, because really stress is just the body needing to respond to a demand. And in the absence of stress, we're not doing much. So exercise is a stress. Eating polyphenols may actually be a stress on our cells. What we don't want is chronic psychological stress. What we don't want is really high levels of acute stress. Now, our bodies are adapted to handle stress, but they're really programmed to be able to handle acute short-term stressors and then come back to a more stable state. And what we've got now for most people is these chronic stressors that are never resolved. It's, oh, well, maybe my relationship isn't good enough, or maybe my job isn't good enough, or I'm not sure what's going to happen financially, or I'm not sure if this conflict is going to spread to where I live, or I'm not sure what's happening with politics right now, or I didn't get enough likes on my social media posts, so on and so forth. And I'm not trying to say that those things are not important. They are important. But I think that by and large, we have become kind of accustomed to being perpetually stressed. And we actually have a society that's normalized being perpetually stressed. There's always more you can do. You're never quite enough as a person. You can always do better. What that does is it has a number of effects on our brain. One of the core kind of examples I like to give as far as what stress does is the adaptive mechanism. So psychological stress is picked up by the brain in response to something that it perceives as a threat to your surviving. So again, if you're walking down the street and it's nighttime and you hear a noise behind you, your brain's going to pay attention to that because something bad might be lurking in the bushes. Some smells might actually tell you there's a threat. Obviously, some things that we see tell us that there's a threat. And when that happens, the brain says, okay, forget everything else. We're going to stop worrying about digesting this food. We're going to stop worrying about reproducing. We're going to stop worrying about building shelter. We're going to get tunnel visioned in and we're going to deal with this problem, which again makes a ton of sense because historically, the threats would be something like a wild animal or somebody from a rival tribe who's coming out to attack you. So yes, you need to be focused on that and forget everything else. But when you play that out over the long run, we start getting this tunnel vision that takes us away from being able to focus on the important stuff. So we can't move forward with the little things because we're so focused on these concerns that are never going to resolve. We kind of get stuck in these loops where our brain is perpetually worried about what could happen in the future. Stress in our brain is basically saying, there is some danger in the future and we need to come up with a plan, which is great if you can identify the danger, come up with a plan, and resolve the issue. If you can't identify the danger, if it's nebulous, it's like, I keep watching the news and it keeps saying that things are bad, but I don't know that things are getting better. That's a problem because you're just revving up those pathways in the brain. And those pathways in the brain tell your brain not to focus on being calm, not to focus on the long-term play. It's telling you, be worried now. Not good for our mental health. What it also does, though, in the aggregate, is it actually changes the way your brain is structured and functions. Because stress turns out to be toxic to a region of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is located right behind the forehead, and it's the part of your brain that has a huge say in higher level thinking, reflective thinking, being able to make decisions for the future, being able to have empathy for other people. And so stress, again, seems to be toxic to those neurons. And on the flip side, it actually activates and strengthens the neurons in a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is a part of the limbic system involved in emotional regulation. The key here is you need to have what's been called top-down control. You need the higher centers of your brain, like the prefrontal cortex, to say to the amygdala and to these emotionally reactive areas, hey, we don't have to be perpetually worried. We can think about the future. And so if you're walking down the street and you hear the crunch behind you, it's the prefrontal cortex that says, hey, you know what? I actually saw there were some cats a little while back. That's probably what it is. Don't need to panic. All is well. But if that prefrontal cortex is damaged, and if the amygdala and these more limbic structures get the final say, that's going to really rev up your heart rate. It's going to get you to be really stressed perpetually. So thinking about that in the aggregate, you start to just change out the balance where all of a sudden you're feeding forward into a state of brain function where you're constantly anxious, constantly stressed about things. So it makes these changes within the regions of the brain as far as their strength. One of the ways it additionally may damage the brain is by ramping up inflammation. So we've talked about inflammation. It is a state of perturbed immune function, just like stress, very helpful in short amounts. Just like stress, very unhelpful when it gets chronic. And so chronic stress begets chronic inflammation in the brain. This can damage neurons. This can damage neuroplasticity. And this is one of the reasons why chronic stress is linked to risk for neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, as well as to mental health conditions like depression. So all of this is to say, we need some stress. We want to experience some stress. Learning a new language is stressful. Public speaking is stressful. Travel is stressful. But it's when it becomes perpetual, when it doesn't resolve, that we have issues. And there's obviously a huge body of research around what to do about this. And I think it is so unreasonable when people say, well, just don't be stressed. You're going to be stressed. Life is stressful. The key is to mitigate it as much as you can. So if you have a kid that is stressful, you can still do things for yourself to help decrease that stress. One of those we've already mentioned, nature exposure, but it might be mindfulness and meditation. It might be exercise, and it might be working with a psychotherapist. These are all great options. The key here is, though, to understand if we're experiencing chronic stress, we really do need to do something about it, because both in the short term and in the long term, it's really not good for the brain.
Yeah, I tell my clients, we're not going to get rid of your kids. We're not going to get rid of your job. We're not going to get rid of the fact that you're taking care of your aging mom, but we do have to find ways to deal with it. And from a nutrition standpoint, I talk a lot about having chronically elevated cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, and that causes all sorts of challenges with eating and weight and energy and other health conditions. So is there a link between stress and cortisol levels and nature? Is that a way to reduce them?
Practically speaking, cortisol is one part of the puzzle as it relates to stress. It's one thing that you can measure. I think it's usually the most common biological measurement of stress. Most of the time, people will just do psychological measurements, say, how are you feeling? Are you feeling stress? Is life getting you down? Are you overwhelmed? These types of questions. And then if you want to look at, well, is this person's stress pathway activated? Again, serum, hair, salivary cortisol tends to come up a lot. I do think, though, in the aggregate, nature is an excellent way to decrease stress. You really need to take a holistic approach to how a person should come at stress, because it's like the analogy of the splinter or the rock in the shoe. And you say, well, you could take breaks in your walking so that it doesn't hurt as much, but you probably need to address the rock that you have in your shoe. And so I think stress is one of those types of things. So if your work is really stressful and you take 20 minutes each day to go into nature, that could help you to mitigate the stress. But at some point you have to ask the question, is the job set up in the way that is best for me? And I think, again, getting to what I already referenced, for many people working with a trained psychotherapist or just in general working with a therapist can be an amazing way to help to make some inroads there, because it helps you to identify the patterns of thinking that may be perpetuating some of these anxious loops that are really just not adaptive. And one other thing I'll just say on that front, there are things that were once adaptive, potentially even earlier in your life, that maybe aren't as much anymore. So one that I have is constantly working to try to get the best grades, right? When I was trying to get into medical school, really striving for that perfection and always trying to find a way to improve that. But at this point in my life, it's good to be able to say, look, this is a good enough job for this specific task. And so addressing that and saying, well, I don't need to carry that stress of saying it's not perfect. I didn't do enough work for all of these things. Those are the types of things that a therapist can help with as far as addressing these patterns that get you into stressful conditions.
Orgain's all-in-one nutrition shakes are formulated for everyday nutrition and cater to a variety of health needs and conditions. Available in dairy and plant-based options, these shakes have been carefully crafted to deliver 16 grams of high-quality protein, along with up to 22 essential vitamins and minerals, and a wholesome blend of organic fruits and veggies. For little ones, Orgain offers plant and dairy-based organic kids shakes balanced with 8 grams of protein, essential nutrients, and a delicious mix of fruits and veggies. Even the pickiest kids will be asking for more. Take charge of your health and the well-being of others with Orgain. Visit Orgain.com today to explore the full range of products. I'm a Bastyr University graduate, and that's a naturopathic university here in the Seattle area. And the doctors there and the dietitians, like myself, we often suggest something called forest bathing. Is that a term that you use too?
Yeah, forest bathing is kind of the American interpretation of Shinrin-yoku, right? That's the Japanese term. It's a couple decades old. Japan created this whole area of research because at the time, their government was interested in getting people outside, helping to improve their mental health, but also getting people out into nature. So they started subsidizing the research into the question of how does nature actually influence health? And they basically pioneered this field of understanding some of these mechanisms that we've discussed, that nature exposure helps to decrease blood pressure, increases heart rate variability, improves immune function, decreases stress. What I really like about forest bathing as kind of an implemented term is it's not a very prescribed thing where you have to do it in a certain way. At its core, the idea that being in nature translates into wellness benefits, and all you've got to do is just get outside and be in that experience. Going for a walk in the woods, spending some time with plants, being in the garden. I guess that's technically not a forest, but I think that's actually a great way to connect with nature. I think it's the type of thing where you let people have their exploration the way that it works for them. What that brings in a lot is the research around mindfulness as well. We know that mindful treatments, mindful experiences are significantly correlated with better mental health and can help to decrease stress. And mindfulness has really been lost from the modern world where everything we do is mindless. And so nature exposure and just being in that space of, I'm going to pay attention to the way the wind feels on my skin. I'm going to look at these trees and see the patterns in their trunks. I'm going to see how at this point in the year, the blooms are coming out and what those flowers look like later in the year, how things are changing in the fall. There's something really profound about saying, these are the data signals that our brains are evolved to pay attention to. And we become so dissociated from it because your blueberries are always in stock in the grocery store, and you can get oranges up here in the Pacific Northwest, even though there's no orange trees for 1,000 miles. And if you start to let your brain get exposure to the things that it's used to exposure to in the context of just nature, which is really what forest bathing is all about, just being in nature, I think it's such a powerful and simple strategy. So yes, forest bathing, Shinrin-yoku. Several books have been written on this subject, something we cover in depth in Brainwash, the book I wrote with my dad, if you're interested in any of the specific studies or where kind of that field got its origin. But it's easy enough. It just means getting into nature.
I will definitely put your book, Brainwash, in the show notes. In that book, you mentioned something called disconnection syndrome. Is this along the lines of what we're talking about now?
Absolutely. it's kind of an overarching theme. It's this idea that if we were to look at health, if we were to look at what's going wrong, that there is this disconnect that has progressively arisen that goes in between everything from cellular level to social and societal level, where if we were to look at how people interact today, this whole kind of me first and not caring about the us, we become disconnected from each other. And so much of what we're seeing around the planet is a reflection of that. We become less empathetic in aggregate, and we become narcissistic and self-centered. And this has profound implications for kind of the fate of the planet. As it relates to our interactions with nature, absolutely, we're more disconnected than we've ever been. As it relates to our food now is something that our grandparents wouldn't have recognized. It's been so heavily processed that it's not even food, it's something else. Certainly it contains calories, but we are eating too many calories and too few nutrients as a relative ratio as far as the nutrients that are linked to health. So we're disconnected from our food as far as it being real food. We're disconnected from where it comes from. We're disconnected from the soil that it's grown in. And within our actual health, and really we focus on the brain, coming back to this idea of the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the more we see the effects of things like inflammation and stress on the brain, sleep deprivation on the brain, the more we realize that the connectivity, the way our brains are wired, is so important for us to experience quality lives of happiness and good brain health. So we can see the disconnection there as well. If we get to the level of kind of cellular health, what we see is a significant problem with the way that our cells process energy, with the way that our cells handle immune signals. And so what we have is this breakdown in the way that food gets transmitted into data for our cells and the way that our cells then are able to engage in health. We see this at the level of the mitochondria, which are certainly undergoing a ton of stress, both in terms of metabolic and immune stressors from the body. And this leads to how we are able to function, our energy levels, our brain health levels. We see this at the level of our microglial cells. So microglial cells are the brain's immune cells. And in the right context, they can either become more of a helpful or a harmful cell. And in response to this disconnect that we're seeing with our diet, with stress, with sleep, microglial cells get converted into an unhealthy version that actually perpetuates inflammation and disconnects us further from other people. This is complicated stuff on the surface, but here's what it really means, just to put it into context. When we consume foods that rev up inflammation in our body, this tells our brains, tells our microglial cells to produce more inflammation. Inflammation in our brains disconnects us from each other. When you take a healthy person and increase inflammation, they withdraw socially from other people. When you have inflammation in children's brains, which we see in the context of air pollution, they have more trouble doing well on tests. But also people, when they have more exposure to air pollution and the inflammation, they have more violent behavior. So what we're saying here is, from a disconnect perspective, it actually separates us from each other. It takes away our empathy, and it goes throughout all of these different systems in the body. The good news here is there's so much we can do to start bringing these things back together to create connection. And one of the reasons I've been so excited about the work we're doing here at Big Bold Health is we work with farmers, we work with fishermen, we work with the soil. And what we see here then is saying what connection looks like in a circuit is to say, we've got to care for nature, because when we do that, we create healthier food. Then when we eat that healthier food, it creates healthier humans. Healthier humans are then able to live in community better because our immune systems are more in balance. So everything is connected here. And so the one side of this is things are becoming more disconnected. The good side of it is we always have the opportunity to make votes for connection. It can be the real simple stuff. It's also kind of an existential issue at this stage.
You mentioned, anything from camping or going on big adventures outside to just taking a walk or going to a park or a playground. You mentioned virtual reality, which I think is fascinating, but I can see then you're not going to get those molecules that you need in your nose. You mentioned gardening. Sure. What about opening your windows and plants in your house? Like, what counts?
Yeah, I mean, you can see probably here in my background.
Yeah, you're doing it. Yeah.
Well, I'm doing it because my partner, Rachel, is much better with plants than I am, and I get to be the beneficiary of that. Bringing plants into the house is a great one. Opening the windows is an interesting one. So a lot of the work I'm doing now is around air pollution, and we haven't gotten into this in too much detail, but the short version is I think poor quality air is maybe the most important hidden driver of disconnection, of brain inflammation, things like depression and dementia. And the problem with it is it's so covert, right? We don't necessarily know the quality of the air that we're breathing. And to that end, for most people and most of the time, opening the windows is a great idea. But if there are wildfires, if you live in a city, if there's a lot of traffic nearby, then opening the windows may not be a good idea. And what you can do is you can go online, you can look at AQI, and you can see what is the quality of the air where you live and get a sense as to whether it is recommended that you can open the windows, should spend time outside, or whether it is kind of a bad idea. And I hate to say that because I want people to be more connected with nature, but it is the reality that if you live in the Pacific Northwest, wildfires are a real thing. Even in New York, Toronto, and large swaths of America and around the world, air pollution is a real thing. So I'm always a fan of opening the windows unless A, the air quality is low, and B, if you're trying to sleep at night and it's really loud out. This is actually an area where I think tech is a great solution. Air purifiers are great technology, and I think sound machines are a great technology. So if you want to sleep with your windows open, granted, it's a little hard to hear the birds in the morning, but the sound machine can help to do a great job drowning out the outside noises. So it improves the quality of your sleep.
Yeah, it just takes a little creativity, and it's fun to think about your partner, your family, who can you go with, your neighbors, and that also could create a sense of community as well.
Totally. And if you can get outside, spend time in nature with people you care about, or when you're exercising, I've gotten really big into the pickleball community up here in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm outside for part of the year, at least, playing pickleball, which is a cognitively demanding activity, which is good for your brain. And then there's the socializing component of it. So you get the benefit of multiple things at the same time. So if you can stack the benefits, that's even better. You're
so aware of the research. You're doing the research. What's next for us in the next 10 years?
There are a lot of really exciting breakthroughs that are happening. In the brain health space in particular, we are gaining a much better understanding of what it is that is actually happening in the brain in people with Alzheimer's disease, people with depression. And I use these perpetually as examples because these are two of the most common conditions, one being a prototypically neurodegenerative disease, the other being, by definition, a mental health condition, but where we're understanding what's happening with the immune system, with metabolism. So there's lots of great work being done now to understand how metabolism, meaning glucose levels, insulin levels, and the flux of metabolites in our bodies influences our brain health. Similarly, with the immune system, we're understanding how it's not just inflammation as an aggregated term, but specific markers and specific molecules that can help predict a person's risk for brain health issues and may be helpful in predicting what they might respond to. So I think that's really exciting. As it relates to some of the specific kind of connections between diet and brain health, I'm doing research right now on a branch of science called epigenetics. And epigenetics is the field of science that studies how marks on top of our DNA change the way that our DNA is used. So historically, we've thought about our DNA as being relatively fixed. If you have one gene, you have one outcome. If you have a different gene, you have a different outcome. And epigenetics has changed the field completely because now we understand that it's not just the DNA we have, but how it's used. And the way it's used is determined by epigenetics. What we're studying at Big Bold Health is this question of, we know food can be healing or harmful. And as it relates to the properties of plants to be helpful, we typically think about vitamins and minerals and the macronutrient. But the third group of molecules in plant foods are called phytochemicals or phytonutrients. And there are thousands of these. Generally speaking, I would say we think about these as antioxidants. So if you're a conventional doctor, you say, eat your colorful fruits and veggies. Why? They have more antioxidants. Okay, but consuming more antioxidants does not necessarily, if you were to concentrate it down, improve health outcomes. So there's more to the story than this. It's really never been shown that just antioxidants explain why plants are healthy in humans. It's a lot of cell studies. And so the hypothesis, which I think is now very well grounded in this research, is that these phytonutrients, phytochemicals, of which one group is called polyphenols, can actually change the way our DNA is being used by modifying epigenetics. And that is a mouthful and a half as far as the science goes. But what we're talking about here is a frame-changing shift in how we approach the idea that food can heal. It's about each food having a unique signal to our genes that actually changes how those genes are used and changes our immune makeup, our metabolic makeup, actually the wiring of our brain cells using this epigenetics. The game is just so different. And so our research group has shown that polyphenols, specifically those that are in Himalayan tartary buckwheat, are linked with about a 25-fold or 2,500% change in how certain genes related to the immune system are being used. And these are actually pathways related to genes, related to aging. So it gets a little bit technical, but the bottom line to all of this is we're starting to release this new genie, which is saying it's not just about a food has antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals, and that's it. It's actually about saying a food is a lot more special than that. And so now we're tying in how the food is raised, because if you raise a food in healthy soil with healthy microbes, it has more of these polyphenols, and not just more, but different types of polyphenols. So you're changing this signal. You're basically taking data from the soil, from the plant, and it's being transmitted into humans because these polyphenols change the way our DNA is being used. And so what we have then is, I think for the first time, a real understanding of this idea of this kind of like one health, this one planet, that all of these systems are interconnected. And my hope is that this gives people a reason to care about more than just, okay, I'm going to eat this food. It has X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to lose weight, or it's going to do this thing. And instead saying, I want to eat foods that contain the right signals, that have the right type of makeup to help give my body the data it needs to support health. So I think that's really big. I'm also involved with a research group where we're looking at how psychedelics actually impact the epigenetics of people and the immune system. And so it's this bigger conversation around how does nature interact with humans? And even that is a little bit of an issue, because it's not as though nature and humans are somehow different, right? It's not, there are animals and there are humans. We are all part of nature. Humans are part of nature as far as we've tried to distance ourselves. And so how does nature influence humans? Epigenetics seems like it's a huge component of that. I'm sure we'll find in years to come that people who spend more time in nature have different epigenetic signatures than those who spend all their time indoors. But we're looking specifically at food and these polyphenols in Himalayan tartary buckwheat, and then asking whether certain psychedelics may actually exert their effects by way of the epigenome. So I think that's actually changing the entire landscape of brain health. I think beyond that, we're starting to see a more invested audience of people who are looking for and are willing to do things to improve their health, to take steps to prevent dementia, to start talking about depression prevention, not just treatment, to start talking about taking mental health conditions seriously, not just to be worried that other people will judge them for it, but being open about saying it is good to seek psychiatric and psychological care. All these are really amazing improvements in the field as it relates to caring about brain health.
I'm going to be following you closely because this is fascinating research. And one thing that I'm so happy about today is you connected all the pieces within the body and then how we are also connected externally and to each other. So thank you for being on here today. This was really fun.
Yeah, I had a great time as well.
Our show is sponsored by Orgain and produced in collaboration with Large Media. That's LARJ Media. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Good Clean Nutrition Podcast. To stay up to date on the latest podcast episodes, be sure to follow. If you like this podcast, I'd love for you to let me know. You can rate and review this show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or you can give us a thumbs up on YouTube if you're watching right now. I'm Ginger Hultin. You can find me online at gingerhultin.com. Thanks so much for listening.